technical difficulties. Is that better? Okay. All right. Good. Well, good morning. And welcome those who are viewing online. One of the valuable reasons why we go through like the narratives in First Kings, Second Kings is we can learn an awful lot from, the narratives of these people. The Bible works basically on three levels. One level is, of course, the commandment level, and the level, this is God's instructions. The second level is the principles level. That's what you get into, like the parables, the proverbs. The third level is a narrative level, is where we see how it's operating, good and bad, right, in the lives of people. And going through First Kings, Judges, First Kings, Second Kings, these places, we could see the operation of these things. One of the things that we see here is what is talked about in James chapter 3 is the untamed tongue. Had Shimei kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have gotten into trouble. And a lot of times our big mouths are the ones that cause us all kinds of trouble. And one of the things that happens is when you speak out of turn or out of anger or out of bitterness, you can't take it back. I mean, you can apologize, but it's out there. And it's been multiplied in the effect in the modern age, because once you send your text out, right, or once you send out your email, or once you post it on Facebook, it's there. And actually, in the legal system, those become permanent legal documents. And we see that with the Supreme Court Justice's wife, where the email she sent now, they want to subpoena her and stuff like that because that's a permanent record. You might delete it, but it's out there somewhere. And so this is what we have in Shimei. He probably would have been a horrible person to give a cell phone to and have him text. I mean, and of course what he did was in frustration many years before we come to this passage, but it still lingers there. There's some oddities about this. We're going to talk about that. But, James 3 says, who can tame the tongue, right? Like trying to bridle a wild horse. I mean, it's like a fire that once it gets started, it just, especially when we speak out of frustration or anger, and then if we come back and say, well, I really didn't mean that. Well, you actually said that, and quite often people really say when they're angry what they've been thinking all along, don't they? And that's one of the problems. Well, let's take a look at the story of Shimei. Shimei's last act of 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 36. We read the following: Then the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go out from there anywhere, for it shall be on the day that you go out across the brook Kidron. Know for certain you shall surely die. Your blood shall be on your own head. And Shimei said to the king, the saying is good, as my lord the king has said, so your servant will do. So Shimei dwelt in Jerusalem many days. Now it happened at the end of 3 years that two slaves of Shimei ran away to Achish, the son of Maacah, the king of Gath. And they told Shimei, saying, look, your slaves are in Gath. So Shimei rose, saddled his donkey, and went to Achish at Gath to seek his slaves. And Shimei went and brought his slaves from Gath. And Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had come back. Then the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you, saying, Know for certain that on the day that you go out and travel anywhere, you shall surely die. And you said to me, the word I have heard is good. Why then have you not kept the oath of the Lord and the commandment that I gave you? The king said, moreover, to Shimei, you know, as your heart acknowledges all the wickedness that you did to my father David, therefore the Lord will return your wickedness on your own head. But King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. So the king commanded Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck him down, and he died. Thus the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. Okay, Shimei, of course, is a leftover from the era of David's reign. By the way, the word Shimei means famous. And believe it or not, there are 18 men in the Bible named Shimei. So if you look at a Bible dictionary, this is the only one we really know of, right? But if you go in the Bible, there are 18 men, including one of the sons of David. His name's Shimei. And so it was a common name, but this is the only one we really take note of because of, the interaction with David and the king. But there are 18 men, probably more than most men, maybe anyone in the Bible, 18 men named Shimei. And the word means famous. Shimei was a Benjamite. He's the most famous of those who are named Shimei because, or shall we say, the most infamous, because of this interaction. So he's a prominent Benjamite who supported Saul. In 2 Samuel 8:16, when David is fleeing from Absalom, Shimei stands on the hillside throwing rocks down at him. Now, it's probably not a very smart thing to throw rocks at an army. That's probably not a good thing to do. And is cursing David, basically, saying, may the Lord bring down the wickedness that you did to the house of Saul, and the fact that he's paying you for your sins and all this. And, of course, at that point, Abishai wanted to go out and knock off his head. That's the brother of Joab, nephew of David. And he says, no, maybe the Lord has told him to curse me this day. David's one of these moods. Of course, David had been told that because of what he did with Bathsheba, because of what he did to Uriah, that the Lord would bring the sword into his house. And Shimei is just putting salt in the wound. Shimei should have done what? Should have kept his mouth shut, right? It wasn't his place to do this. Now, here's what I find puzzling. David's reaction to me is kind of strange because he prevents Abishai from killing him at that point. He could have. He's bringing aspersions upon the king. It's not his place to do that. When David comes back, he refuses to execute Shimei when Shimei comes and asks for forgiveness and says, no one shall die this day. This is a day of great victory. But then on his deathbed, he tells Solomon to do this. Well, it was in his power to do it, right? It was in his power to execute. And apparently this is stuck on David's craw all these years. And so when you fast forward to 20 years later, now he says to execute him. So when we go back, when we go backwards in time here to the time where Shimei is coming and asking for forgiveness, it really wasn't a true forgiveness, was it? It wasn't a pardon, because forgiveness is what? Right, you're not going to hold to account. All basically David was saying at that point was, no, today is a great day of celebration. We're not going to mar it by executing it. By the way, Saul said the same thing when the Lord led him to defeat the Ammonites. He said, okay, who are those men who said they're not going to follow Saul? Come here, let's execute. He said, no, this is a day of great victory. We're not going to do that. So he comes, and apparently all these years stuck in his crawl. Now here's the odd part. He could have executed Shimei at any time. He had cause as king. Basically Shimei's speech could have been considered a threat to the king, right? He was obviously somebody that, maybe the king would have considered would lead a rebellion. And so, but he doesn't execute. But he does tell Solomon to do that. Now, if you read commentaries, the common thinking is the fact that David wants Solomon to start with a clean slate, right? He doesn't want any leftovers like Joab or like Shimei who could cause problems in the kingdom. And so he's saying keep an eye on it. So Solomon, he's going to keep an eye on him by literally keeping an eye on him. You're not going to leave this area. So obviously this insult is stuck in David's craw. He really is just not, he never gets over this. And by the way, there's a principle here, right? I mean, if you forgive, you need to what? You need to let it go, turn it over to the Lord, right? I mean, if you offer forgiveness, it should be true forgiveness, right? For example, if your spouse says, I forgive you for what you did, but you keep bringing it back up, is that forgiveness? No. I mean, yeah, you might not forget it, but forgiveness means not holding to account. That's what it means. And so this sticks in David's craw. And so here he comes, and he's insulted, and he said no one's going to die during his victory celebration, basically, when Shimei asks for forgiveness. By the way, Shimei was not smart, I think, on two levels. First of all, what he said. And secondly, he wasn't very smart when he should have gotten out of town, right? He's hanging around. He knows the king's upset. Well, if you know the king's upset, it's probably a good idea to get as far away from, that area as possible. But he hangs around. Joab hangs around. So he didn't want Solomon to have a known enemy to undermine his kingdom, because David knows that Shimei said exactly what he meant, right? He really didn't think that Saul should have been taken out like he was. By the way, who took Saul out? Well, God did, right? I mean, he lost in the Philistines. It wasn't David that did that. Matter of fact, David actually showed deference to Saul, remember? He refused to do any harm to Saul. He's not going to speak against the Lord's anointed. And so it was not David that did this. It was God. So Solomon calls Shimei to his palace, and Shimei's thinking, what do you think Shimei's thinking? I'm done, right? He's thinking I'm going to be executed. Because of his reaction, we know that's it. He surely fears he's going to be executed. Any leniency would be relief, right? Anything short of being executed. Now here, I find this interesting here too. I mean, all these 2 decades have passed, and Shimei probably thought David had forgotten all about this by now, right? I mean, he didn't execute me. And all of a sudden he gets a note, It's like during coming up when I was coming up as a young man in the Vietnam era. If you get a letter that says, greetings from the President of the United States, it wasn't a good thing. And it goes on to tell you about your neighbors want you to go to war, and you ask your neighbors, and no, I didn't say that, Well, that's what the letter says, And so, and we had it registered at draft board, and mine was in Hyattsville and back there on Route 1. And I don't know, by the way, I was thinking about this morning because, I watch these war shows on Saturday, evening. And do young men still have to register with the post office for selective service? They still do. At 18, they still have to register. Okay, I didn't know. Yeah, I didn't know that's still a rule. And I know that the Congress has been trying to, some Congress have been trying to pass where women have to do it too. Yeah, you have to register with the Selective Service still. Wow. Okay, and they were going to try to pass for ladies to do that too. So I don't know if they've done it. Yeah. Yeah. Equal rights. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, well, so we had to go through all 5 of our boys. We had to send them down to the post office, and you got to go register. That's the law. What's that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you applied for college, unless you registered, they wouldn't let you, no loans or anything like that because, you had to register. And so it's kind of interesting, So anyways, that was just to say, certain messages you don't want. Like, when a letter comes from the IRS, you probably really go gulp, now what, or a letter comes from the DMV or MVA, So any leniency would be a relief. So Solomon does not execute Shimei. Shimei is commanded to build a house in Jerusalem for himself, and he's never to leave the city. So Shimei is on house arrest. That's what he is, right? Solomon doesn't execute him, but he says, I'm going to keep an eye on you. Just stay right here. So Shimei is put under house arrest. Solomon must have felt that he could not execute Shimei outrightly without appearing arbitrary and vengeful, so he puts conditions on. And by the way, there's 2 things I want to note that goes back to the Garden of Eden. Number 1, that's a stipulation. God says you can do anything you want unless you what? Eat of this one tree. Basically, Solomon's putting that same type of stipulation. You do anything you want as long as you stay within this boundary here. And by the way, old Jerusalem was not large. So his world shrunk real fast, And the second thing I want you to notice is that the day you there surely die. It's the same exact wording that God told Adam. May oath, die and you shall die. That's exactly the same wording that we find in the Garden of Eden. Okay, it's kind of interesting. So Solomon doesn't execute him. And Shimei declares the terms, those are fair. I can live with that. Why? Because otherwise he'd be executed. So given a choice between living in a small space and not living at all, he'll take the living in this confined space. Now Shimei must have been a man of some means. He owned slaves. So he must have been somewhat of a prominent man. And so after 3 years, 2 of Shimei's servants run away to Gath and the Philistines. They probably felt that they could do this because of the fact that Shimei wouldn't be able to go after them because they know the restrictions. And by the way, I don't want to read too much into this, but the way Shimei acted to David, maybe he wasn't the best master either. If he was arbitrary in that, I don't know. But anyway, they run away. They take the opportunity to run away. They run out to Gath. And I find this very interesting, too, because Gath is where David ran away to get away from Saul, another King Achish that he was under. So he ran away to the same place. Gath is where Goliath is from. Isn't that interesting, And David had a number of his palace guards were from Gath. The word Gittite means from Gath. So he had a number of Gittite. So there's a tie-in with Gath. It's the closest Philistine city to Judah territory. You have 5 Philistine cities, major cities. You got Ashdod, Ascalon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. And of course, Gaza gives a name to what? The Gaza Strip today. Okay, that's where the Philistines were, in the Gaza Strip. Okay, and so just sort of tied into modern times. Shimei had settled in, forgot all about the terms. his slaves run away. Perhaps he thought, well, Solomon hasn't done anything, forgot, Probably not even thinking about it. Well, if my slaves run away, I have to do what? I have to go get them. I have to go find them. They said, okay, your slaves have run away to Gath. So he goes to Gath, comes back, and thinks that no one's going to notice this, and someone tattles on him. So I said, do you know that Shimei broke the terms? By the way, that's another principle. There's always someone watching. There's always, there's a proverb that says, be careful what you whisper in your house because birds will carry it to the king. And so we have here, and like King Agag, Shimei thought that his danger had passed. And so Solomon calls Shimei before him, and Shimei is probably thinking, uh-oh, this is not good. And Solomon reminds Shimei, remember we had an agreement. I told you that you're not to leave Jerusalem. I also heard you tell me that this is good. I can accept this terms. So why have you violated your oath before the Lord? And so Shimei said, the blood is on your head. And by the way, that's a forgotten principle today. It's the fact when a criminal commits his crime, he needs to do what? He needs to pay for his crime. You have these lawless, supposedly officials who just let him go and they commit more crimes. Okay? And so they released them, but not today. Shimei calls it, so he says to Benaiah, who seems to become the main executioner, doesn't he? Go out and take care of him. He's the one who killed Joab. He takes him out and says, the blood is on your head. If someone, like when you have to punish your child, you say, this is not because I'm punishing you because of what I'm doing, it's because of what you did. And that's one of the major principles of Scriptures. Whatever you sow, that's what you got to reap. You got to make sure that principle is a key part of justice. And so we have that. So judgment delayed is not necessarily judgment removed. That's one thing Israel had to learn. Just because God didn't kick them out of the land immediately doesn't mean that he'd forgotten about their sins or winking at their sins. It eventually comes out, right? That eventually catches up. And by the way, let me make a political statement here. I usually don't like to do that, but it's really a political world, and we happen to be in a very political area. Someone held the door open to Gene during one of our trips and asked where we're from. I told D.C. area, and he said, I'm sorry. I said, I'm sorry too. But the whole, this city eats and drinks and sleeps politics, right? But listen, this whole backwards concept that if I don't punish someone who's in school, I'll prevent them from going to jail later on. Actually, you are enhancing and enabling them. There's no consequences, right? If you give them consequences early, you might be able to help deter it. But if they say, well, there's no consequence, so they continue on. That's the way it is, And that's Ecclesiastes 8:11, which is a very powerful, powerful principle. It says, men's hearts are lifted up to do evil because justice isn't speedily executed. Men's hearts are lifted up to do evil because justice isn't speedily executed. Okay? Because there's no deterrence in it, right? So Solomon's throne, it says, is established, and all his old enemies have been eradicated. Solomon now has an opportunity for a fresh start. But if you have an opportunity for a fresh start, you're still responsible for how you're going to treat that opportunity. A lot of people get second chances and blow that too. And so he has an opportunity for a fresh start here. So Israel also understands that Solomon will execute justice and in his own desires. They see that he does this. But eventually a person who sows something will reap the same results. And that's what Solomon tells Shimei. He says, because of your vile curses, it's come back upon your head. And though he seemed to have been forgiven and reprieved, his fate was in the hands of the rulers. And by the way, that's another principle. As we get society is more and more wicked, and as it's the opposite of what the scriptures are teaching us, we're going to have to face the consequences of wicked rulers. And decisions going to have to be made. And so, for example, if in my position as an auxiliary chaplain, if they said you got to affirm this diversity of homosexuality, transgender, I'll resign my commission, resign my membership, because there's certain inviolable principles, right, that you have to stand for. And so I can respect the people and person. That's the way I teach my cadets. But if it comes to a point where it says, you have to affirm this, I can't do that. Okay, and so as this government becomes more and more wicked, and by the way, when I was in Russia, when I was in Minsk, they have creative ways of getting around some of these. A Ukrainian pastor says that we're not allowed to hold gatherings or preach, outside of Sundays. So they meet anyway. And the officials come in and says, no, we're having a birthday party and everybody's invited. and we bless people with the scriptures. One of the pastors, was sent over there and says, listen, you can't preach to us, but you can do a 30 to 40 minute prayer with lots of scriptures. So, so there's creative ways some of the Christians get around some of this stuff. So it's important to know when and how to stand. And by the way, this is important. Let me say this, and I have one of my sons who's really excited about opposing things. I don't think it's beneficial to jump up and down and scream and yell and threaten. I don't think that makes change. I think you've got to be wise, right? The Lord said to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. There's effective ways, there's non-effective ways. And we have to, you don't lay down, but there's ways. You notice Paul, when he preached, he was respectful to leadership, but he preached truth. He had both, right? He wasn't standing up saying, these dirty, rotten emperor, this dirty. He didn't do that. Or even the high priest who had brought him to trial, he didn't do that. He was respectful, but truthful. We have to learn how to do that. And I don't think jumping up and down and screaming and yelling and busting windows in the Capitol building and stuff like that, I don't think that's an effective way to oppose evil. I don't think laying down and hiding is either. But we've got to be wise in what we do. And so it's important to know how to oppose and control the tongue. We have this example. I'll end with this before we open the discussion. Notice the difference between Shimei, when he was opposing David, ends up because of death. And Peter, who stood before us, say, listen, we got to obey God. Peter did not, criticize the leadership. He didn't say you guys are a bunch of bums. But he just said we just have to obey God. And whatever you want to do, you do it. There's several examples of proper way and improper way of doing it. For example, when back, in your guys' neck of the woods back in Nebraska, right, where the homeschool was beginning to start, and the pastor was running, and the state said you can't do it. They brought him before the